Hi friends, my name is Oswin. The purpose of this video is to provide you with an overview of the project management body of knowledge, the uh, popularly called as the PMBOK guide, a publication of PMI. The purpose is to provide a bird's eye view of the entire guide. Now, before we get into the bird's eye view, a note of observation. It's very important that we realize the difference between a framework and a methodology. Now, the guide to the project management body of knowledge published by PMI is not a methodology. A methodology is a structured approach to managing a project in terms of a defined life cycle with defined phases, activities in the phases, and a defined governance structure, so on and so forth. So at the very outset, it's very important that we realize that the project management body of knowledge is not a methodology. Rather, it's a framework. It's a compilation of best practices around different areas of knowledge within the world of managing projects. And therefore, it's important that we realize this particular distinction at the very outset. I would like to take you to page 25th of the PMBOK guide, which kind of contains which contains the overview of the entire framework. Uh, Page 25. Now that is a very important map that you would need to keep in mind if you are planning to either prepare for the project management professional examination, or if you intend to customize the framework to develop a methodology for your organization. Now, one of the things that PMI has done in terms of managing the knowledge in the area or in the world of managing projects is to uh, classify all of the knowledge into 10 areas or 10 buckets. And these buckets are called as knowledge areas, and there are 10 knowledge areas in this particular framework. Let's begin with the first important knowledge area, which is project scope management. I'll just highlight that for you. So that's the first knowledge area that we're going to look into. Now, when we talk about project scope knowledge area, we're talking about things like requirements of the project. Now, it's very important that at the very outset we understand what is it that we are planning to build on the project. In other words, what are the key deliverables that we're going to build on the project, and what are the requirements that needs to be taken care of as a part of building those key deliverables. It is very important that we distinguish two aspects of scope when we work on any project. We need to distinguish between product scope and project scope. Now, when we kind of talk about product scope, we are talking about creating technical deliverables. And when we talk about project scope, we are talking about management deliverables. Let me give you an examples to differentiate both of them. Let's say you're working on creating a software for an organization. Now, when you are working on developing a software, you would need to code the application. Now, your code could be an example of your product scope, whereas the risk register, for example, that you create to manage the risks on your software development project is an example of your management deliverable. Your quality register that you create is an example of a management deliverable. The plan that you create, the schedule that you create, the work breakdown structure that you create, they're all examples of management deliverables. Whereas the code, for example, the design of the application, the testing of the application, those are all examples of technical deliverables. So when we talk about project scope management, it's very important that we capture the product and the project scope as we work on managing scope on the project. So when we talk about scope management, seasoned project managers would talk about deliverables like work breakdown structure, requirements documentation, and things of that nature. So the moment you think about scope management, think about making sure that you include your product and your project scope. Moving on to the next area of knowledge, which is schedule management. It's not good enough that we know the scope on the project. We need to know what the timelines are for the project. Now, when we talk about schedule management, we are talking about the duration that a particular deliverable would take, or the effort it would take to create a particular deliverable. What are the dependencies between various between various tasks within a project, work breakdown structure or project activities. What is the minimum time, for example, required uh, to complete all of the tasks on the projects. If you talk to seasoned project managers, they would talk in terms of the critical path of the project. So schedule management to a large extent talks about duration, effort, dependencies, and the resources that would be working on the project. In other words, one of the key deliverables that we would be creating as a part of working on scheduling management is a document called a project schedule, or schedule baseline, for example. Now, a lot of project managers, especially on large projects, they would use scheduling tools like Primavera or Microsoft Project uh, to develop their project schedules. Of course, there are a lot of cloud-based solutions available that could be used to create project schedules. In other words, scheduling does require a significant understanding of scheduling tools, as large-scale projects would have a greater amount of activities and tasks which need to be managed, and you would need to manage the dependencies of the tasks and manage the scheduling baseline. Now, it's very important to realize that schedule management is strongly linked with scope management. The next area of knowledge that we're going to look at is the area of knowledge called cost management. Now, it's not good enough that we merely know the scope and time of the project. We also need to know the aspects of cost on the project. Now, in the world of managing projects, they consider scope plus schedule plus cost to be triple constraints on triple constraints. In other words, these are elements that would limit your project. So you need to know what your budget is. How do you estimate your costs? What are the various elements that need to be plugged in when you estimate your cost? What are your estimation techniques? And things of that nature are usually elements which are dealt with as a part of cost management. PMI talks about a very important controlling tool called earned value management, which is a tool that is used to control your costs on the projects. Now, your scope, your schedule, and your cost combined together is what constitutes your baseline on the project. The term that PMI uses to represent all of them is a term called project performance baseline. It's very important that we know this term if you are preparing for the exam. Project performance baseline. Yeah, which is a composition of your scope plus your schedule plus your cost. Now, these are the three important areas of knowledge in any project. But then we know that your scope, your schedule, and cost are influenced by other areas of knowledge on projects. For example, one of the areas that would impact your projects is a knowledge area called quality management. Now, when we think about quality on any project, it's very important that we think on two different levels. We need to think on the level of the product, and we need to think on the level of the processes that we adopt to create the product. Now, it's critical to realize that the quality of the processes that we use determines the quality of the product that we deliver. And therefore, we need to have an approach to manage the quality of the processes and an approach to manage the quality of the product. Now, in the world of quality, the approach that we use to determine or rather manage the processes, the quality of the processes is a term called quality assurance. And the approach that we use to determine the quality of the product is called quality control. So we need to have a QA and a QC approach in place for managing the quality of the deliverables and the processes. Now, it's vital that we know that the quality approach that we adopt would have a bearing on the scope of the project. Let me give you an example. Now, let's say you would like to include multiple tests on your project, let's say activities. Now, all of the activities pertain to testing, reviewing, are elements of activity on the project which would have to be reflected in your scope management. And those activities are performed by resources. It would consume time, it would consume effort, and of course your resources do come with a cost. And therefore, it's important that we realize that quality has a bearing on your scope, your timelines, and your cost. Now, another area of knowledge that PMI has given is the area of knowledge called resource management. Let me scroll down. All right. Yeah, resource management is the next area of knowledge. Now, in the world of managing projects, it's important that we realize the availability of our resources. Resources do play a significant part in managing projects. Now, when PMI talks about resources, it does not restrict itself to just the people part of the resource, but it would also include your your equipment, raw material, venues, etc. All of them combined together are your resources. Now, resource also is a constraint on a project. We don't have all the resources that we need. We have limited resources, and we need to prioritize those resources. And therefore, what kind of resource management strategy do we have in place? How do we estimate our resources? How are we going to acquire our resources? What kind of organizational structure are we working in? And now that would determine the strategy for acquiring our resources. How do we train our resources? How do we develop them? How do we motivate the teams? How do we manage the performance of the resources? How do we control issues with the resources? Are all elements that are usually covered as a part of resource management. Now, another important area of knowledge is a knowledge area called communications. Now, communications is a significant area of work for any project manager. PMI is of the opinion that project managers spend almost 90% of the time on communications. Now, that's a significant amount of work that a PM does on communications. Now, that's 90% of a project manager's work. Now, when we think about communications, we are thinking about who are the target audiences that we need to talk to. What are their communication needs? What's the frequency of those communication needs? How often do they need those communication needs, and what's the method of communications? Do they want communications by email or a face-to-face approach, or is it something that they would like us to kind of leave in a repository? Things of that nature are the methodology of communications. And who are the people on the project who would make sure those communication needs are going to be taken care of? And how do we monitor the communications? Are all elements that are critical to communications management. The next knowledge area is a knowledge area called risk management. Now, this is a very important area of knowledge in the context of projects. Now, when we think about risk management, we're talking about the approach that we're going to use to manage uncertainties on projects. Now, unlike operations, projects are exposed to greater amount of uncertainties. So we would need to identify those uncertainties. We need to prioritize those uncertainties. In other words, we would need to kind of have a mechanism whereby we say, well, these are the red risks on the projects, these are the amber risks, or these are the green risks, or these are the high, medium, or low risks on the projects. Again, you might not have the resources, or you might not intend to deal with all the risks on the project. There has to be a way of analyzing and prioritizing your risks on the projects. And sometimes PMs might even quantify the exposure on the project. So you need to kind of have the needed mechanism or needed scales or needed infrastructure for a quantitative risk analysis. And finally, what kind of response mechanisms are you going to use? How are you going to respond to risks on the projects? Are you going to transfer the risks? Are you going to accept them? Are you going to mitigate them? Are you going to exploit them? So you need to define your response strategies, and you need to kind of have a defined risk management strategy or an approach for managing your risks on the project. Well, an important aspect of observation is again the fact that the responses that we choose on the risk front would have a bearing on the let me get rid of this drawing tool. Would have a bearing on the scope of the project. Well, if the response strategy is to mitigate, so mitigation comes with an activity. Well, you got to plug in that activity in your scope, and that activity would have a defined timeline, resources, effort, and people involved, and that would definitely cost you, and therefore risk would contribute to refining your baseline further. And the next knowledge area is a knowledge area called procurement management. It's important that we look into procurement because we live in a world of dependency. Well, a particular organization might require help from contractors, from vendors, suppliers, partners to help them in achieving their goals. And we need that. We need a procurement strategy. When we talk about procurement, we are talking about things like, well, is it beneficial or is it of strategic, let's say, significance for us to make the product or buy the product? You do a make or buy analysis. Well, if you decide to buy, you might want to kind of define your procurement process, from the point of invitation for bidding, through request for information, through RFPs, through vendor selection processes, through identifying a right vendor and issuing a contract to that vendor, are all elements which are part of your procurement processes. And then once you have the vendor on board, well, how are you going to measure the performance of your vendor? How are you going to control that vendor? Are all elements pertaining to procurement knowledge area. And the last knowledge area, the last but one, is the stakeholder management knowledge area. Well, On larger projects, we not only deal with a lot of internal stakeholders, uh, deal with a lot of external stakeholders. You know, your external stakeholders could be your regulators that you would need to deal with. They could, they could involve government bodies. They could, involve uh, shareholders, for example. There could be yeah, government entities, and the list kind of goes on. And many a times, PM does not have influence on a lot of these stakeholders. And therefore he would need to kind of identify the right people within the organization who would be dealing with these stakeholders, and what kind of stakeholder management strategy do you have in place? How do you manage the stakeholder engagement? What kind of meetings, what kind of forums, and what is the significance of the stakeholders? You need to identify the stakeholders by mapping them on their power and influence within the organization or without the organization, and what kind of strategy do we have in monitoring the stakeholders are elements that we need to think when we think about project stakeholder management. And finally, the last knowledge area that PMI has given is a knowledge area called integration management. Well, integration is a very important aspect of managing projects because end of the day, we cannot look at all of these knowledge areas in isolation. You need to kind of you need to integrate all of the elements of your project into an integrated whole. Let me just give you an example of what we mean by integration. Um, let's pick up, let's say, one of the processes in integration knowledge area um, to give you an example of what I mean by integration. Um, let me pick up this particular process. Now, one of the key management deliverables that we create on a project is a document called a project management plan. Now, the project management plan is a document that combines all the elements of your project performance baseline. If you recollect, we kind of talked about an element called project performance baseline, which is a composition of your scope, your timelines, your duration, your resources, and the cost of the project. So you need to integrate all of these three elements as a part of your project management plan. So besides the project performance baseline, you also need to integrate a lot of the subsidiary plans that you create in terms of plans such as risk management plans, quality management plan, communication management plan. So you kind of bring them all together and you kind of integrate them as one single comprehensive document called the project management plan. Now that's the reason why we have the integration management knowledge area, which kind of helps us integrate the different aspects of work that we do across the project. On a final note, it's very important that we recognize the project uh, life cycle that we use for managing a project. Now, in any project, broadly speaking, the phases of the projects would include initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. Now, PMI would not use the word phases, but they would use the word called process groups. And by what they mean is, by that, what they mean is, when we work on the life cycle of a particular project, or when we work in a particular phase, we might want to think about what are the areas of knowledge that we would like to work on when we initiate that particular phase of project. What are the areas of knowledge that we would need to work on when we, let's say, work on the planning phase or the planning element of a project? What are the different processes that we need to look into on the different knowledge area front when we work on execution? What are the different knowledge areas we need to look into when we monitor and control the projects? And finally, what knowledge areas we need to look into when we close the projects? In other words, what PMI has done is PMI has kind of come out with 49 processes in total. 49 processes in total to represent the work that we would be doing across the 10 knowledge areas. Yeah? There are 49 processes, and each of these processes is a compilation or a collection of inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs. In other words, when you work in a particular process, you create a particular deliverable, you create a particular management deliverable. And to create that management deliverable, you would definitely use a lot of tools. And well, to create that management deliverables, you need certain inputs. And therefore, a process captures the elements of inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs. Now, in the next few series of videos, what I would like to do is take you through some of the management deliverables in terms of the content that goes into each of these deliverables. For example, 4.1 is a process which gives us a project charter document. Well, what is a charter document? What are the contents of a charter document? So I would like to pick up a template and take you through the template items of a project charter to help you understand the contents of a charter, and I'll give you a brief about each of these deliverables, and I hope this particular approach of taking you through the management deliverables or the outputs of these processes would help you appreciate the framework better and help you understand the framework in a better way. Thank you for watching this video. If you would like to reach out to me, you can reach out to me at the following email ID. I'm reachable at pobox.oswin@gmail.com. So let me just kind of, yeah, poboxoswin@gmail.com. So you could kind of reach out to me. Um, I work as a management consultant, and I carry with me 22 years of work experience. I had the opportunity to work with some of the big four firms, and one of my passions is to coach, mentor, and train people. I am into building and sustaining capabilities. Some of the areas of my expertise would be portfolio, program, project, and PMO management, besides risk, IT service, and Lean Six Sigma disciplines. And please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would be more than happy to help you out. Thank you for watching this video.